We're coming now to the third lecture in Module 9. And in the first two lectures, we talked in general about the concept of law and order. And then in the second one, we took a closer look at some key terms in the Old Testament that relate to this question of law and covenant and so forth. There was covenant, was that agreement that is founded in the behavior of God, and that God himself is willing to submit to and invites Israel to submit with him. And then the second part, righteousness, is actions that are in harmony with that covenant. Unrighteousness would be the opposite. And then finally, judgment is weighing whether or not righteousness, in fact, has been done. Now, when you get to the New Testament, it raises the big question. Does the New Testament handle the same terms in the same way, or does the New Testament go in a completely new direction? And that's what we'd like to do together. And I think if you will follow carefully, you will find that there's some very exciting things going on in this concept of the New Testament and its relationship to law. So first of all, the word covenant. This is debated considerably among many scholars, New Testament, denominational scholars, theologians, etc. Is the New Testament based on the same covenant as the Old, or is it not? There's often terms like old and new, different language related to, so many people have the impression that covenant has a completely different meaning in the New Testament than it does in the Old. Yet, I'm concerned about that just on the face of it, because if covenant in the Old Testament is fundamentally grounded in the character of God, how could God now come up with some different covenant? And if he does this covenant somehow violate his own character, violate who he is? I think that's the question one has to wrestle with. But why don't we go straight to Jesus? And we will find this in the text, Matthew chapter 26. And let me go find that here in my Bible. So we'll go over to Matthew. And when we're in Matthew, let's go to chapter 26, the very end of the book. And we're looking at verse 28. So Matthew 26 and verse 28, which is part of the Last Supper perspective here. All right, Matthew 26 and verse 28. For here it says, Jesus is offering the cup at the Lord's Supper. So this is, the bread and the wine. That's what this is all about. And as he offers the cup, he says, drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. This is my blood of the covenant. Now, he doesn't say a covenant. He says, the covenant. It's my blood of the covenant. What covenant is that? It would be the covenant with Israel. After all, the whole event that Jesus was doing here, this bread and wine and stuff, it's actually a Passover celebration. And this Passover celebration reminds of the Exodus and the covenant God made at Mount Sinai after the Exodus. So the covenant would then be the covenant that God made with Israel back in the book of Exodus. That is the only covenant that a Jew would recognize, and it is Jews who are celebrating Passover with Jesus. So Jesus says, when he offers this cup, he's saying, essentially, this is the blood of the covenant. You remember that in the Exodus, blood was placed on the doorposts to represent the passing over of judgment in relation to Israel. Jesus says this is the blood of the covenant. So it must be the same covenant as the one you have in the Old Testament. If there was more than one covenant, he would define it more carefully than he does here. So the New Testament then does not use the word covenant in a different way than the Old Testament does. The emphasis here is on continuity. There's one covenant. Well, what is the difference then? What difference does Jesus bring? That we will see in a moment. But let's go to Romans chapter 10. So we turn to the book of Romans, and there we'll go to chapter 10. And in chapter 10, I want to go to verse 8. Romans chapter 10 and verse 8 says, what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. So Paul here is saying that the word of faith, the gospel that he is proclaiming, is near to them. But on what basis does he say it is near to them? It is based on a quotation from Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 30, Moses tells the Israelites that God is near to them, that this message is near to them. It's near you, in your mouth and in your heart. So Paul here is saying that what Moses promised the Israelites, he is promising to the church through Jesus Christ. It's the same covenant. The preaching of the apostles does not contradict that covenant. The preaching of Paul and the apostles is in harmony with that covenant. Now, in some of the texts of the Lord's Supper in the New Testament, it does use the term new covenant. This is my blood of the new covenant. And it can be called different things, but new in this case does not mean new in content. In a real sense, new in the Greek means more renew. It is renewing the covenant. And I think that is a better way of expressing it. The covenant is being renewed in Jesus Christ. It is not something totally different from what went before. And when you read in the English, the new covenant, you say, well, that means it's in contrast to some other covenant that is old. That's not the intent here. The new covenant, whatever that means, is not new in content. It's the same basic covenant that's grounded in the character of God. In other words, when Jesus dies on the cross, that is an action that is in harmony with the covenant. Let's see that stated clearly, and we'll find that in Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. And right toward the end of that chapter, verses 68. You have Zechariah, who is excited that he has a son born to him in his old age, the son of the promise, and his name will be John, and so forth. And he sings a song. And here is that song. It says, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us." Verse 72, to show the mercy promised to our fathers and to remember his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our father Abraham, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all of our days. Here's the interesting point I want to make very, very clear. When God sends Jesus, he is not forgetting his holy covenant. He is remembering his holy covenant. Remember, the important thing is here, there's one covenant. He's remembering his covenant. All of God's covenants, plural, that you might see in the Old Testament are grounded in one basic covenant. And he remembers his covenant when he sends John the Baptist and ultimately Jesus, because Jesus is the one that he is talking about when God has raised up a horn of salvation in the house of David. That's referencing Jesus rather than John. The birth of his son John precipitates this song, but the song is really ultimately about Jesus, who is the one who comes down from heaven. He is in the house of David. So with the coming of Jesus, God is acting in harmony with the covenant. In fact, I think the New Testament writers would say that God has never been more faithful to his covenant than he was when he sent Jesus. So this is a fundamental theological insight, and understanding Paul is not always easy. But Paul starts on the foundation, look, I'm a Jew, I believe in the covenant, I'm not doing away with the covenant, I'm not abolishing the covenant. The cross of Jesus Christ is acting in harmony with the covenant. So the Christ event, the death and resurrection of Jesus, is a fulfillment of all that God promised earlier in the covenant. Now, do you have a bit of a basis to believe all of this? Everything else that we've done in this course, walking from Genesis through Malachi, we were setting a foundation so that it would make sense here. All of that we saw was pointing in some sense to Jesus. All of that is understood by the New Testament as a prefiguration of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The great mighty acts of God in the Old Testament are simply setting the table for the greater, mightier act in Jesus Christ. So there's no difference in covenant. It's the same covenant at its best that is grounded both the religion of Old Testament times and also the situation here in New Testament times. So covenant is the same. What's the difference then? Let's go to the word righteousness, and let's see how the New Testament uses righteousness. And I would argue that the New Testament uses righteousness in exactly the same fundamental way that the Old Testament does, but with one little twist, and we'll see what that is. So let's go to Romans, and Romans chapter 1 will do. Romans 1. And this is a famous text. It's the text that got Luther started. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." What is the gospel? "For it is the power of God." The gospel is not the power of man. It's not the power of humanity. It's not something we do. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As is written, the righteous shall live by faith. The gospel, ultimately, the definition of the gospel is that the righteousness of God is revealed through faith. What is the righteousness of God? Go back to the Old Testament. What is the righteousness of God? It is God's actions in harmony with the covenant. You see, there are those who say that the new covenant, the New Testament covenant, is in contrast to the old, that it has a different way of salvation, a different kind of righteousness. And there are many who say that for various reasons. But I think that leads to a misinterpretation of Paul. Paul is not saying that. To the contrary, he's saying God never acted more righteously than he did in the gospel. The gospel is grounded in the covenant. The gospel is action in harmony with the covenant. It is a revelation of God's righteousness. The gospel reveals that God acted in harmony with the covenant even when he saved sinners. And that's very important because the very act of saving sinners might raise question. Sinners means they broke the covenant. If they broke the covenant, they should be destroyed. But if sinners are being saved, how is that righteous? That's the question that Paul is wrestling with here. And let's go ahead a couple of chapters. Romans 1, 2, 3. Moving on to Romans chapter 3. And let's go to verse 21. And we've covered this already in the class in more detail, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but I want to focus on this point. What is righteousness? He says, now the righteousness of God has been manifested. What is the righteousness of God? It is God acting in harmony with the covenant. Where is that being manifested? He says it's manifested apart from the law, apart from our obedience, apart from law as a principle of action, as a way to get saved. God's righteousness is being manifested apart from law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. And that underlies the same point. It's not a different covenant. It's not a different righteousness. The Old Testament bears witness to the very gospel we're talking about here. The righteousness of God is manifested through the faith of Jesus Christ to all who believe. It was the faith of Abraham. The faithfulness is really the Hebrew concept. It is the faithfulness of Abraham that was the foundation of the original covenant. Now it is the faithfulness of Jesus Christ that is the foundation of this new covenant. The two are the same in principle, but the twist is this. Instead of Israel being seen as needing to respond in harmony with the covenant, Israel is now lumped together in Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ, in behalf of Israel, obeys the covenant, lives in harmony with the covenant, acts righteously. So here you see Jesus Christ acting righteously in his perfect 33 and a half years on this earth. He acted in harmony with the covenant. And because he is the representative of all Israel, his righteous action can be distributed to all those who live in relationship with him. So there's a couple of realities in this text. First of all, God never acted more righteously than he did in the Christ event. When Jesus lived on this earth, he perfectly obeyed the covenant. He acted in harmony with the covenant. But the second reality is that righteous action comes to us apart from law, apart from my perfect obedience, which I am unable to render. God found a way to justify the ungodly and still be in harmony with the covenant. That's the beauty of all this. When you understand what covenant righteousness and judgment are all about, you begin to realize that God is acting in harmony with that covenant to save those who are not in harmony with that covenant. Verse 26. Verse 26 says, "It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus." God is acting through Jesus Christ in harmony with the covenant, creating a righteousness that he can give away. You see, God is not obligated to obey the covenant. That is something that he is handing off to human beings. God in his universal mode can do whatever he wishes. But God has chosen to subject himself to that covenant, to behave in harmony with it, and even to come down as a human being and live out that covenant with all the disadvantages that come from being finite and human. And in spite of that context, he still acts in perfect obedience to the covenant. He acts in harmony. He acts righteously. And so in Jesus Christ, God acts in harmony with the covenant. What is the twist? Remember I said there's a twist. Covenant has the same meaning as the Old Testament. Righteousness is the same meaning as the Old Testament. The difference is that Jesus Christ is Israel. As we saw in previous lectures, Jesus Christ is Israel. He's the Redeemer of the Exodus. He's the Redeemer of the monarchy. He's the Redeemer of Adam, the Redeemer of the exile, the Redeemer of Abraham. You see, Jesus, because of who he is, because he is the Creator, because he is the founder of Israel himself, Jesus Christ can take the place of Israel, can obey in Israel's behalf, and pass on the blessings of the covenant to Israel and ultimately the whole world. You remember Galatians 3, that in Jesus Christ he reaped the curse and he also lived out the blessing. And because of that, he can offer a blessing to those who are under the curse. Well, what about judgment? All right, what about judgment? Is judgment have the same meaning as it does in the Old Testament? Again, with a bit of a twist. Judgment continues. The same language is used, this language of evaluating whether or not righteousness has been done, whether or not the covenant has been observed, except now God's judgment is exercised at the cross. The cross of Jesus Christ is an act of judgment. John chapter 12. John, the 12th chapter, and verse 31. John 12 and verse 31. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people unto myself. So the cross of Jesus Christ is not only a righteous act, it is not only in harmony with the covenant, but it is an act of judgment. At the cross, the human race is being judged as to whether it is righteous or is not. And how can that be? How can the entire human race be judged at the cross? And here's the twist. It is only because in Jesus Christ you have a representative of the entire human race. Jesus Christ takes the place of the human race, is a substitute, if you will, is a representative of the human race. When Jesus hangs on the cross, it is an eschatological judgment. The whole human race is being judged. As one writer puts it, it is as if at the cross of Jesus Christ, the angels of heaven came down. God himself, the Father, came down. And they all gathered around, unseen, but they all gathered around the cross. The judgment there was set. The books were opened. And Jesus Christ, representative of the entire human race, the bearer of human sin, as Peter puts it, all of our sin was laid upon him. At the cross, then, judgment took place. There were all the cosmic signs of judgment. You had an earthquake. You had darkness. You had resurrections that occurred. So the Christ event was like an eschatological judgment. And the books were opened. Judgment was placed upon Jesus Christ. And they looked at 4,000 years plus of human sin, all heaped up upon Jesus. And the human race was found wanting. And the judgment fell on the human race. And when Jesus Christ died the second death on the cross, he died that in behalf of the entire human race. But the judgment doesn't end then. It adjourned for perhaps 36 hours. And it reconvened on a Sunday morning. And there, the judgment books examine 33 and a half years of perfect righteousness. 33 and a half years of action in harmony with the covenant. And the judgment there made is, well done, good and faithful servant. enter into the joy of your Lord. And Jesus is raised from the dead. And in that resurrection, the entire human race is being blessed. Remember Abraham's promise? Through him, through his seed would be blessing to the nations. That is grounded in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. When Jesus was raised from the dead as the representative of the human race, we all were, in a sense, raised with him. God's approval fell upon the entire human race at the cross. So in relation to this one man, the eschatological judgment fell on the entire human race. So at the cross, you see twofold judgment, just as we saw it with Adam and Eve and Cain and the flood story and Abraham and so on. God's judgment is always twofold. It is both blessing and it is curse. It is both positive and it is negative. There is mercy and there is wrath. There is heaven and there is hell. At the cross, the entire human race stood in judgment, was condemned on account of its sin, but was blessed and raised up on account of his righteousness. There's a great reversal that took place there. This judgment at the cross is elaborated in several other New Testament texts. I'd like you to look at them with me. Let's go first of all to the book of Romans. And Romans is a book that's very prominent when you're dealing with these kind of issues, particularly the legal language. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 3, we see something very interesting. It says, "For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do." You see, the law by itself has limitations, simply because of the weakness of the flesh. It is because of who we are that the law cannot save us. Once we have sinned, we cannot make it up anymore. However, God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. And for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh. At the cross, God condemned human sin in the flesh of Jesus Christ. So we see that judgment took place at the cross in the person of Jesus. Judgment on the entire human race. Negative judgment on account of human sin. But there's also a positive side. Let's go to the previous book, and that is the book of Acts, and go to chapter 13, and there we will see Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey, and they are proclaiming the good news of the gospel. Turn to verse 32. Verse 32. It says, "We bring you the good news." That's the word gospel. "We bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus from the dead, as it was written in the second Psalm, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.'" Here's a fascinating statement. It says, all the promises of God belong to you because he raised Jesus from the dead. And you say, what? What does that have to do with anything? He has fulfilled God's promises to us by raising Jesus? That only makes sense if Jesus Christ represents the whole human race, that if in the raising of Jesus we too are raised, it makes all the sense in the world. The blessing that God promised for obedience to the covenant is grounded in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That when Jesus is raised from the dead, God is demonstrating his agreement to bless the whole human race in Jesus Christ. Because of that perfect 33 and a half years, because of that righteousness, because of that action in harmony with the covenant, it is possible for the covenant blessings to come to the people of God now. This is not the only text that says that. Let's go to 2 Corinthians. And 2 Corinthians, just a few short books down. And 2 Corinthians chapter 1, I'd like to go to verse 20. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 20. And it says here, "For all the promises of God find their yes in him. And that is why it is through him that we utter our amen to God for his glory." All the promises of God find their yes in Jesus Christ because of his perfect obedience, because he acted in harmony with the covenant, because he is our substitute and representative, because he is what Israel was, because he is Israel. Then everything he does accounts to our benefit, and everything he earned becomes ours by faith. All the promises of God can be handed out to us because of what he did on the cross. And that's the gospel. When you ask Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, what is the gospel? And he will tell you. It is the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He was died, according to the scriptures. He died. And he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures. That is what the gospel is all about. And the gospel makes sense if in some way the death and the resurrection of Jesus is the death and the resurrection of all of us. Becomes my death and resurrection, becomes your death and resurrection. In the cross is the judgment of the entire human race. And Paul and John and other gospel writers have mingled this concept of judgment with salvation. Salvation is found in legal categories in the New Testament. It is a judgment concept because judgment is never only negative. Judgment is also positive. It is a setting right of things that are wrong. It is undoing the damage that has been done. So judgment has this positive sense when you get to the New Testament. But judgment doesn't end at the cross. And that's also a New Testament message. And let's go to John chapter 3. In John chapter 3, let's go down to verse 18 and beyond. John chapter 3, verse 18 and beyond. Judgment in the first sense of the entire human race occurs at the cross. But there is a second sense in which the whole human race is judged, and that's found in John 3, verses 18 to 21. And there it says, "Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God." Now, it's important to stop here just for a moment, and translations are attempting to express something that's very important. He's saying here, if you believe in Jesus, you're not going to be condemned. That's seeing that the word here is actually judged. The Greek word is for judge. There is a word for condemnation, but the word here is the word for judgment. You are going to be not going to be judged. And I think the translators move away from that direct reference because they don't want people to get the impression that negative things come to those who are in Christ. And that's correct. But it's perhaps overlooking the idea that the word judgment is not in and of itself negative. Judgment can be negative or positive depending on the context. So let's read it in that way. "Whoever believes in him is not judged, but whoever does not believe is judged already because he's not believed in the name of the one and only Son of God. And this is the judgment. Light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil." So what we see here is that judgment has actually come in what? In the presence of Jesus Christ, in the preaching of Jesus Christ, in the light that he has brought to the world. Judgment is taking place. And that judgment takes place whenever the gospel is preached. Whenever Jesus is lifted up before the people, whenever the gospel is being shared, judgment takes place. How is it? It is because whenever the gospel is preached, people are either drawn closer to Jesus, or in their rejection of that message, they are driven further away. You see, the hour of preaching is the hour of judgment. The hour of Bible study is the hour of judgment. The hour of invitation to follow Jesus is the hour of judgment. When I think about that, I kind of say, I don't want to ever preach a half-baked, half-hearted sermon again. Because preaching is the hour of judgment. People are either drawn closer or driven further away. If you have a half-baked, half-hearted sermon, you're inoculating people against the gospel when it finally does come. They get so used to hearing the gospel and not really being confronted by it that when it actually comes, they may be oblivious to it. The entire human race is judged in the preaching of the gospel. Whenever Jesus Christ is lifted up before them, the gospel is being preached. And who is it that rejects or accepts? Verse 20. It says, "For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light lest his work should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God." How does a person respond when the gospel comes to them? It depends to a large degree on how they have responded to the Spirit of God up to that point. If up to this point in their lives they have been living authentically, when the gospel comes to them, there will be a natural tendency to receive it. For John, this authenticity is critical. Why do people reject the gospel? Verse 20, "Lest their deeds should be exposed." People reject the gospel. It says, "For everyone who does wicked things hates the light, does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed." People avoid the gospel when it comes because they know somehow the gospel is going to expose the truth about themselves. You see, what is confession? Confession is simply telling the truth about yourself. Now, what is the gospel? Once again, the gospel of the cross is two things. First of all, the gospel is the recognition that human existence is condemned in the judgment. Human beings are rebellious. They have sinned. They have ignored the law of God, ignored His covenant, ignored His appeals. The first statement of the gospel is that nothing about you is acceptable. Nothing about you is worth saving. Your actions, your deeds, they stink. They are wretched. They are miserable, poor, blind, and naked. The gospel, first of all, is a condemnation of human sin. But second of all, it's the recognition that that same person, that same sinner, is valuable and has lived a righteous life in Jesus Christ. That same person who's condemned on account of sinfulness is accepted on account of the righteousness of Christ. The resurrection is a miracle we can't duplicate. If we are resurrected in Jesus Christ, it's a miracle of God. It's something that God has done. The gospel is the power of God to raise the dead. It's the power of God to change lives. It's the power of God to save the unsavable. It's the power of God to bring righteousness by faith into our lives. And so we see at the root of acceptance or rejection of the gospel is the issue of authenticity. There are people who seek to live authentically, who are willing to be out in the open, are willing to be candid about their mistakes. For these people, the gospel will be a welcome event, because the gospel means you can exchange this garbage for the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ. Who would not want to do that? Well, evidently, the person who has been hiding their true nature, the person who is hiding their deeds, who is hiding their disobedience. And when the gospel comes, they realize, if I'm going to get this gospel, it means that I'm going to have to come out and to expose myself, to be willing to say, I was wrong, to be willing to say, I have sinned. You see, the gospel is two things. It's not only an offer of free salvation, it's also a condemnation of who you are by history, by deeds, and by nature. And so, when the gospel comes, people either naturally are drawn to it or tend to resist that gospel. And that is because the full gospel is grounded in both the cross and the resurrection. The full gospel is grounded in the reality that we are sinners, we are completely unworthy of God, we are under the curse, we are condemned, but in Jesus Christ we can be accepted. In Jesus Christ we have His perfect righteousness. Let's go on a couple of chapters. There's another text I think that is helpful, and that is John 5, verses 22 through 25. And here it says, the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him that sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment. Here the ESV translates it right. He does not come into judgment, but is passed from death to life. Judgment here does have the negative sense. He does not receive negative judgment, but rather he receives the positive judgment of passing from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. So judgment comes in the preaching of the gospel. Whenever Jesus appeared, whenever that light appeared, people were making decisions one way or the other. And that judgment was taking place. In a real sense, when the gospel comes, we judge ourselves. We judge ourselves. We judge whether the righteousness of Christ will be applied to us. And in order for that to happen, you can't escape the judgment on your own life, your own behavior. That is the lesson that comes through powerfully here. But keep in mind, all of this judgment language is grounded on righteousness, is grounded ultimately on the covenant. And what does the covenant tell you? The covenant tells you that God does not judge arbitrarily. God is not vindictive. He's not severe. Instead, there is a God who desires to save us, a God who is willing to go to the cross to save us, a God who loved us this much. That is what God is like. Our fate is not dependent on vindictive wrath or impulsive love. That's why these legal categories are there in the Bible. That's why they are important. Because there are many people who will never, ever trust themselves to God unless they know that God is consistent, that God is fair, and that God has found a way to be righteous, even in rescuing the unrighteous. The peace that is made by the cross is a lasting peace. It is consistent. It's reliable. The whole idea of law is to provide security and reliability. And so the law, as grounded in these legal categories, gives us the assurance that when God accepts us, it's not just a momentary thing, but it is grounded in the fundamental law of the universe. So when you come to understand these things, you understand that for the New Testament, the gospel is not some new thing that's imposed upon the scriptures, but the gospel is in full harmony with the Old Testament. It is in full harmony with the covenant in Old Testament times. It is not some new thing, but Paul says the gospel was already preached in Old Testament times. And you say, how? How was the gospel preached in Old Testament times? It was preached in the mighty acts of God. The mighty acts of God preceded the call to follow Him. Creation preceded the existence of the human race. The Exodus preceded God's call to Israel to be faithful to Him at Mount Sinai. Yes, Mount Sinai is legal. Yes, there are commandments there, but those commandments are not out of the blue. Those commandments are a response to one who has already rescued them. Go back to verse 1 of Exodus 20. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of bondage. I brought you out of Egypt. Therefore, have no other gods before me. You see, the call of God to us is always grounded on His mighty acts. And the cross of Jesus Christ is a new exodus. It's a new return from Babylon. It is a new creation. And because of this, the cross of Jesus Christ is in full harmony with the Old Testament. The legal language in which that cross is grounded provides genuine security. You see, many people think of legal things as being cold and harsh and unfeeling. But the reality is, law is there. Covenant is there to provide security. It's to secure relationships so that they aren't fickle, so they aren't up and down, that we can know that the way we walk with God is solid and strong. And we need that because feelings are what they are. At 4:30 in the morning, I often feel very depressed. I often feel like nothing I'm doing is worth anything. Nothing I do will ever amount to anything. That's 4:30 in the morning. That's feelings. And feelings can drive the way you behave. But God assures us that His relationship is secure. He grounds it in legal categories. He says, I myself will submit to these very things. And so, God's righteousness is fully vindicated by what Christ did. When God chose to save us, who were unworthy, who are unrighteous, those of us who have lived out of harmony with the covenant, God is acting righteously when He does that. He is not acting out of harmony with His covenant, but He is acting solidly grounded on the secure legal realities of the universe. Not everybody will be equally impressed with these teachings, but for many, this is critical to their finding the security that they need, and that's what we all need. We all need to know that our relationship with God is grounded to the place where we can live freely to bless others. We bless others out of the blessing we have ourselves. But if we feel that we are under the curse, how can we bless others? When Israel was under the curse, it could not be the means of the blessing. But when the blessing is showered upon us through the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ, then we can share it with others freely because there is an abundance that will never run dry. And so the legal categories of the New Testament are a marvelous way in which God secures our relationship to Him. And at this point, we make a transition between Module 9 and Module 10. Because in Module 10, we move away from the hermeneutics. We move away from the exegesis. We move away from the biblical theology. That's what these first 10 modules have been about, first 9. And then in the 10th module, we now move to systematic theology. What difference does that make in today's world? How can we take these biblical categories and make them real in the world in which we live today? And that is where Module 10 will take us. So see you then.